They stole my land while I was serving my country. So I gave them what they truly deserved, a flood of justice. When greed meets the force of nature, the truth rises with the waterline. They say when you leave your home to defend your country, you expect to come back to the same place you left. Same soil, same skies, same piece of earth with your name on it. For Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter, that promise was broken. Daniel had deployed overseas on his 5th tour of duty, confident that the land he inherited from his grandfather would be there waiting for him. That land wasn't just acres of soil and rock. It was legacy, nestled just outside the city limits, bordered by woods on one side and a dry creek bed on the other. The property had been in the Carter family since the early 1900s. His grandfather, a World War II veteran, had spent his final years maintaining it, even securing federal approval to construct a small dam to control runoff and prevent erosion long before the area became desirable to developers. Before Daniel shipped out, he ensured all taxes were paid, the fencing around the land was intact, and a trusted local friend was checking in every few months. There were no plans to sell, develop, or divide it. The land was to remain untouched, a promise made to his late grandfather, who often said, "This land stood for something long before people started looking at it like dollar signs." But something changed while Daniel was gone. The nearby town had been expanding rapidly, fueled by rising demand for luxury suburban homes. Developers and real estate investors had their eyes on every inch of open land, especially the kind that came without clear resistance or daily oversight. Daniel's property, despite its federal records and private status, became a target. A newly formed homeowners association called Brookpine Meadows struck a deal with a local developer. Using falsified documents and quietly altered zoning maps, they annexed the land as part of a community expansion project. By the time Daniel returned home nearly a year later, he barely recognized the outskirts of his hometown. Where tall grass and oak trees once stood, there were now rows of nearly identical 2-story McMansions, each with stone veneers, vinyl siding, and matching mailboxes. Roads had been paved over family trails, and a gaudy entrance sign reading Brookpine Meadows, a modern community, stood where the Carter family's wooden marker once was. Shock turned to rage when Daniel drove to his land and found fences torn down, earth flattened, and not one trace of the original property line. 35 homes, all occupied, sprinklers running, porch lights on, children riding bikes where wild turkeys used to roam. His land had been stolen and developed. Daniel's first thought was that this had to be a mistake, some kind of error. But when he spoke to the HOA office, a smug property manager handed him a visitor badge and explained, with a dismissive smirk, that those lots were legally acquired during your absence. When Daniel presented his deed, tax receipts, and federal land survey maps, the manager casually shrugged. "Well, sir, you can take it up with the county if you feel something's off, but we have 35 families living here now. So maybe it's time to let it go." Let it go. Those words rang in Daniel's ears like an insult. He hadn't let go when bullets flew overhead in Afghanistan. He hadn't let go when his convoy was hit with IEDs in Iraq. He didn't serve his country to return to a stolen inheritance and smug apologies. He began his own investigation, pulling every record he could from the county courthouse, speaking with the local assessor, even contacting his congressman. What he found made his blood boil. The HOA had claimed his land was vacant and unclaimed, and the county had rubber-stamped the rezoning without verifying the ownership. Somehow, forged documents and false claims had made their way into official records. It wasn't just a mistake. It was an orchestrated theft. Worse yet, the HOA had sold the homes quickly to middle and upper-class buyers who had no idea they were living on stolen ground. The developers had profited. The HOA board had expanded their power, and Daniel had been left with a hollow deed and a broken promise. But they didn't know one thing. The land might have looked dry and dead when they built on it, but beneath it ran something they never accounted for. Something Daniel had the rights to. Something his grandfather had built with government engineers, recorded in federal land use filings. A dam. And not just any dam. A legal, functional, and fully permitted structure that controlled the flow of the seasonal creek above the subdivision. A dam that still worked. A dam that Daniel now controlled. The HOA had stolen his land. They had paved over his family's name and planted lawns on top of history. But they hadn't stolen the water. And Daniel knew in time that the water would speak louder than any courtroom ever could. Daniel began piecing together the tangled web of fraud and bureaucracy that had led to the theft of his land. His first step was reviewing the property records he had maintained since inheriting the land. Everything was in order, deed in his name, taxes paid on time, no liens or claims. But when he pulled the county's official plat maps, he was stunned to see that his property had been relabeled as part of a subdivision annexation labeled Brookpine Meadows Phase 2. The documents listed a transfer of ownership, signed during the period he was overseas. His signature had been forged. His contact information had been replaced with a P.O. box in another county. The supposed seller listed on the transaction wasn't just fake. It was a shell entity tied to a local developer notorious for shady land deals. Digging deeper, Daniel discovered that this developer had a close relationship with a member of the county zoning board, who also happened to sit on the newly formed HOA board. Several key approvals had been pushed through during special sessions that were held with minimal notice to the public, sessions that occurred while Daniel was overseas and unable to contest any of it. The annexation had been processed using a loophole in the zoning regulations that allowed emergency reclassification of land for public interest housing. It was a clause originally designed for disaster relief housing, but it had been twisted and exploited to justify the sudden development. He consulted a property lawyer, who confirmed his worst fear. The land had been illegally transferred, but unraveling the fraud through civil litigation would be long, costly, and complex. The current homeowners were technically innocent buyers who had purchased their homes through legal channels, unaware of the fraudulent land acquisition beneath them. That meant even if Daniel won in court, it could take years, and the HOA's attorneys would fight tooth and nail to bury him in legal procedures. Worse, his lawyer warned, the county might side with the HOA to avoid liability, especially since the zoning approvals had come from their own offices. But Daniel wasn't alone. A retired Army Corps engineer named Ellis, who had once worked with his grandfather, remembered the dam project. Ellis confirmed that the Carter family not only owned the land, but also held federal water rights tied to the original Army Corps infrastructure, an often overlooked and incredibly powerful legal asset. These rights had never been transferred or dissolved, and they gave Daniel full authority to control the flow of water from the upstream dam down to the creek that now ran along the edge of Brookpine Meadows. That detail changed everything. While the HOA and developers had managed to fake their way through local property transactions, they hadn't touched the federal water records. And those water rights, unlike land deeds, were governed by federal law and enforced through agencies that didn't answer to local zoning boards. It was a kind of legal ammunition Daniel needed, something beyond the reach of shady lawyers and corrupt county officials. He reviewed the original blueprints for the dam and discovered that it had been designed to regulate seasonal flooding by diverting water into a natural basin at the edge of the property. That basin had since been leveled and built over by the HOA, which assumed the dried creek and dam were irrelevant in their rush to build. The developers hadn't accounted for what might happen if the dam was used as intended, especially during a heavy rain season. Daniel now saw what they had failed to see. The very infrastructure they ignored was the key to taking everything back. Daniel documented every violation, every piece of evidence, and began filing formal complaints with federal agencies, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Geological Survey. These weren't the local county offices the HOA could influence. These were national entities with protocols, enforcement powers, and no tolerance for manipulated records. Within weeks, federal investigators reached out to verify the dam's condition and confirm that Daniel, as a legal heir, retained full operational authority over the structure. But Daniel wasn't just relying on government help. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request to pull communications between the developer and the county zoning board. What he uncovered was even darker than he expected. Emails discussing timing the paperwork to avoid military interference, and notes referring to Daniel as the absentee soldier. They knew he was deployed. They saw it as an opportunity that turned Daniel's personal loss into something far greater, a deliberate, coordinated theft targeting someone who was actively serving his country. The HOA had underestimated one critical thing: Daniel's resolve. He wasn't after vengeance. He was after justice. And now, armed with documents, legal leverage, and the weight of federal law behind him, he was no longer on defense. The people who had paved over his family legacy were about to learn that the land they claimed to own was sitting on a dam they didn't control, and water, once released, obeys no boundaries. The dam had always been a quiet symbol of the Carter family's foresight and perseverance. Built decades earlier under the supervision of the Army Corps engineers, it wasn't some haphazard pile of rocks or a rudimentary flood control trench. It was a fully engineered structure with steel floodgates, sediment channels, and reinforced concrete retaining walls. Daniel's grandfather had overseen its construction in the 1970s, back when the land was still considered remote, worthless scrubland by most. But to the elder Carter, it was sacred ground, the kind of place you invested in not for profit, but for legacy. The original purpose of the dam had been modest: to manage the seasonal flooding that threatened to wash away the nutrient-rich soil during heavy spring rains. Over time, however, it became more than just a safeguard. The dam created a small reservoir in the higher elevation of the property, which had supported local wildlife, stabilized the ecosystem, and fed into a creek that gently wound down through the land. That creek, now redirected and ignored, had once been vital not only to property's health, but also to the regional watershed. Federal law had required a long list of permits, inspections, and maintenance logs for the dam, paperwork that Daniel's grandfather had meticulously preserved and which Daniel now held in his possession. More importantly, those records confirmed the one legal detail that the HOA had failed to consider in their land grab: riparian and flowage rights. These rights granted the landowner not only the authority to manage water flow, but also the power to redirect, retain, or release water based on hydrological need, within reason and within seasonal regulations. And because the structure had been approved by the federal government, not local authorities, the power over the dam's operation remained untouchable by the HOA, the county, or even the state without a lengthy legal battle. Most developers ignore this kind of detail. After all, water rights are often seen as outdated, irrelevant relics in a suburban housing boom. But in this case, the rights were not only active, they were enforceable. Daniel now understood the full scope of power he held. If managed properly, the dam could flood the basin that Brookpine Meadows was built upon. The original natural depression that had once held overflow water was now compacted and covered in homes, sidewalks, and manicured lawns. No proper drainage infrastructure had been constructed, likely in an effort to save on development costs. The HOA and its contractors had gambled that the old dam would remain forever inactive. That assumption would prove catastrophic. Daniel brought in a hydrologist to study the topography of the area, comparing modern satellite imagery with historical survey data. The findings confirmed what Daniel already suspected. During peak rainfall, the dam could easily cause the water level in the upper reservoir to rise and overflow into the natural lowlands, the exact area where the 35 homes now stood. With the removal of natural vegetation and the installation of impermeable surfaces like asphalt and concrete, the runoff would have nowhere to go. The McMansions weren't just vulnerable. They were sitting in the bullseye of an entirely predictable, preventable floodplain. The HOA had made the classic mistake of assuming ownership of land equated to ownership of its natural systems. But water, unlike land, obeys no deed. It flows according to gravity, terrain, and containment. And Daniel had legal control over the very source of that water. What had been ignored as a dried-up relic was, in fact, a trigger, one that could be lawfully pulled under the right weather conditions. What made the situation even more poetic and dangerous for the HOA was that the original engineering documents included a clause permitting emergency water released during extreme weather. That clause was designed to protect the upper land from erosion and damage, giving the dam operator discretion in high rainfall periods. That meant Daniel didn't need a court order to act. As long as he followed safety protocols and could show justification based on precipitation data, he could open the gates, fully within his rights. The reservoir itself had been sitting at a low level for years, only gathering seasonal runoff. But weather patterns were shifting, and meteorological forecasts predicted a rainy spring, above average rainfall with multiple back-to-back storms. The stage was being set by nature itself. The Carter Dam didn't need sabotage, secret switches, or hidden intentions. All it needed was gravity, water, and time. Daniel began documenting every maintenance check, every gate test, and every legal notice he filed. He wasn't looking to cause chaos. He was establishing a record of lawful stewardship. While the HOA remained oblivious, debating landscaping ordinances and mailboxes, he was preparing the land to do what it was always designed to do: protect itself. And in doing so, it would reclaim what had been stolen. The Carter Dam wasn't a weapon. It was a legacy. And when the rains came, that legacy would flow downhill, erasing the lies that concrete and siding had tried to bury. With the legal framework secure and the hydrology verified, Daniel shifted his strategy from research to action. The dam was no longer just a historical relic. It was now a powerful bargaining chip. But before any water was released, he wanted to give the HOA and the developers one final chance to acknowledge what they had done and make it right. He drafted formal cease and desist letters addressed to the HOA board, the developer, and the county zoning office. Each letter was accompanied by certified copies of his land deed, federal water rights documentation, and engineering reports confirming the dam's capacity and flood zone implications. The message was clear. The homes had been built illegally on his land, and any further resistance would force him to exercise his full legal authority over the dam and surrounding watershed. He didn't make threats. He made declarations of intent backed by law. The recipients had 30 days to begin formal restitution proceedings or face the natural consequences of their actions, particularly if the region's projected rainfall materialized. The responses came back faster than expected, but not in the way he'd hoped. The HOA's legal team sent a patronizing reply claiming Daniel's water rights were largely symbolic and unenforceable in a modern urban development context. They accused him of attempting to intimidate the residents and warned of legal action if he continued his campaign of disruption. The developers, for their part, denied any wrongdoing and insisted that all documentation had passed legal review at the time of sale. They pinned the blame on the county for approving the zoning. The county, predictably, refused to take responsibility for the forged signatures and stated that any dispute must be resolved in civil court. It became clear that none of the entities involved intended to admit guilt, let alone take action to repair the damage they'd done. Their collective strategy was delay, deny, and deflect. Their arrogance was built on the assumption that Daniel wouldn't have the resources to fight a prolonged legal battle. What they failed to recognize was that he didn't need a courtroom to make his case. He had the law, the dam, and the weather all working in his favor. Daniel submitted his rainfall monitoring logs and hydrological models to the Army Corps of Engineers as required by his federal oversight agreement. He notified the Corps of minor gate adjustments to relieve sediment pressure and ensure continued functionality. These adjustments, while entirely routine, also served to prime the dam for potential downstream flow should rainfall increase. He wasn't violating any laws or acting recklessly. He was fulfilling his legal responsibilities as the registered operator of the dam. Meanwhile, he began documenting signs of risk around the subdivision: driveways with poor drainage, basement sump pumps running nonstop, storm drains clogged with debris. He took photographs, collected videos, and even used drone footage to map how runoff was already beginning to accumulate in the lower-lying areas. All of it was compiled into a detailed report that he quietly sent to local news outlets, environmental oversight agencies, and state emergency preparedness offices. He wasn't launching a public crusade. He was building a record, one that would prove, if needed, that he had warned everyone involved well in advance. In the weeks that followed, Daniel observed subtle shifts in the HOA's posture. Some board members began whispering concerns about water levels. A few residents posted on local forums about unusual moisture and flooding in the parkway. But the leadership remained publicly defiant. They hosted community meetings touting their plans to install new landscaping and repaint street signs. Cosmetic changes meant to distract from the structural flaws buried beneath. Daniel's next step was subtle but strategic. He requested a meeting with the regional office of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, citing concerns about unpermitted residential development in a floodplain. He presented his documentation, including topographic maps, climate forecasts, and a copy of the original engineering diagrams. FEMA officials confirmed that the subdivision did, in fact, fall within a potential flood zone based on the dam specifications, and that no updated flood mitigation measures have been filed by the HOA or developers. That triggered a red flag in the federal database, flagging the area for future inspection and potential insurance review. At the same time, Daniel began issuing notices of liability to the HOA and developers, outlining the legal exposure they face should flood damage occur due to their negligence. These notices weren't lawsuits. They were warnings. Legal experts refer to them as pre-litigation advisories, and their purpose is to establish who knew what and when. If damage occurred and those notices were ignored, it would amplify the financial and legal fallout for the responsible parties. The countdown had started. The skies were growing darker. Rain was in the forecast. And while the HOA focused on lawn care and newsletter formatting, Daniel was focused on timelines, water tables, and liability clauses. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't threatening. He was following protocol. Every step bringing him closer to a reckoning that would be carried not by his hands, but by the rising water itself. The skies over Brook Pine Meadows began to shift from soft spring blue to a heavy slate gray as the first of several rain systems swept into the region. Meteorologists warned a multi-day pattern of sustained rainfall above average for the season, but not unheard of. For most residents in the area, it was little more than an inconvenience. But for Daniel, it was the moment everything had been building toward. The land was preparing to do exactly what it had been designed to do decades earlier: collect, rise, and reclaim its basin. In accordance with federal guidelines, Daniel began carefully adjusting the dam's lower gates to allow minimal but legal downstream release. The changes were well within the bounds of what the original Army Corps permits allowed. Routine adjustments meant to relieve reservoir pressure during a period of expected rainfall. Each action was documented and time-stamped, sent to federal oversight agencies, and logged in triplicate. Everything was transparent. Everything was lawful, but the effect downstream was immediate. The runoff from the rising reservoir began creeping into the lower elevations of the former floodplain, which had been built over by the HOA with zero thought to natural water movement. Driveways that previously stayed dry began collecting puddles. Decorative rock beds installed in front yards started to shift as saturation spread. The soil underneath the neatly rolled sod loosened, and irrigation systems short-circuited under the stress of unexpected standing water. At first, the residents assumed it was normal spring rain, nothing to worry about. But within a couple of days, the true scope of the HOA's oversight started to emerge. The drainage infrastructure, never properly installed or connected to a regional runoff system, began to fail. Stormwater pipes backed up into sidewalks. Manhole covers lifted slightly from pressure. The HOA maintenance team scrambled to respond, but their efforts were reactive and cosmetic. No one had the authority or knowledge to make foundational changes. The original builders had vanished after the last home was sold, and no engineering firm had been retained to manage flood contingency planning. When one homeowner complained about water seeping into their garage, they were offered sandbags and a warning not to park too close to the curb. Meanwhile, Daniel remained silent. He took no credit, made no public statements, and issued no further warnings. He had already done everything the law required him to do. Now, it was the land's turn to speak. Local news outlets began running minor stories about unusual water levels in suburban neighborhoods. A drone enthusiast posted footage showing a curious increase in surface water collecting behind the subdivision. Online forums buzzed with speculation, but the HOA board continued to dismiss concerns, reassuring residents that all necessary precautions had been taken. Behind the scenes, however, anxiety was spreading. Insurance companies began sending adjusters to assess the neighborhood's elevation and proximity to flood sources. One company quietly dropped a policy midterm, citing undisclosed hydrological risk. A city council member called a closed-door meeting to discuss how the subdivision had passed inspection without proper stormwater modeling. The county remained quiet, reluctant to admit they'd failed to verify ownership records before approving development permits. No one wanted to be held accountable, and yet the consequences were slowly creeping up from the soil. The rising tension also created divisions within the HOA itself. Some board members began demanding an emergency meeting to address the increasing water levels and review the original development paperwork. But others, particularly those with personal investments tied to the neighborhood, resisted. They feared that acknowledging any risk could lead to panic, property value collapse, and even lawsuits. Their solution was to downplay, deflect, and delay, exactly the same strategy they had used when Daniel first surfaced with his ownership claims. By the end of the second week of rainfall, several homeowners had already begun to take matters into their own hands. Makeshift drainage trenches were dug behind homes. Gutters were extended with plastic tubing in an effort to redirect the flow. Lawn furniture was moved to higher ground. The mood shifted from casual concern to quiet dread. The term floodplain entered daily conversations. Rumors spread about a dam, about water rights, and about a veteran whose family had once owned the land. No one had official answers, only fragments of the truth. But the ground didn't care about truth or politics. It only responded to water. FEMA flagged the area for potential flood monitoring and placed it under observation. Daniel's dam activity remained fully legal, reviewed by Army Corps engineers, and matched precisely to rainfall trends. Nothing he had done could be construed as malicious or negligent. And yet, as the storm systems continued to pass over the county, each one soaking the already saturated soil further, the pressure was mounting, both beneath the foundations and within the walls of the HOA boardroom. Brook Pine Meadows had been built on stolen land and false confidence. The homes, for all their curb appeal and square footage, were standing on a basin that had once held a seasonal lake. That lake was returning, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow, undeniable truth. And as the water continued to rise, so too did the questions the HOA could no longer ignore. By the start of the third week, the consequences of arrogance and greed had become impossible to ignore. Brook Pine Meadows, once marketed as a modern upscale community, was now beginning to resemble a disaster zone in slow motion. The water levels had continued to rise with each passing storm, and what started as damp yards and muddy sidewalks had evolved into flooded crawl spaces, warped flooring, and knee-deep pools in backyards. The community's pristine image was unraveling, and panic was setting in. Residents, once oblivious to the origins of their neighborhood, were now desperate for answers. Social media groups buzzed with speculation, and one by one, homeowners began to uncover pieces of the truth. Old zoning maps surfaced, showing the area labeled as a seasonal floodplain. Archive Planning Commission minutes revealed rushed approvals. And then came the discovery that broke open the entire narrative. Satellite images from years earlier that showed the land as part of a wide, undeveloped basin bordered by a dam, an active, federally regulated dam that had never been mentioned in any of their purchase agreements. Questions erupted. Who owned the dam? Why hadn't anyone warned them? How had homes even been allowed to be built there? The answers pointed back to the HOA board and the original developers, whose actions had ranged from willfully negligent to outright fraudulent. When word spread that the dam was controlled by the very man they had dismissed months earlier, the veteran who had tried to warn them, many residents turned their frustration toward the HOA. For them, this wasn't just about water. It was about betrayal. The board scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Emergency meetings were held in hastily assembled venues. Residents were handed pamphlets filled with empty reassurances. Some were told the flooding was a temporary drainage issue. Others were promised that contractors would be brought in to regrade certain areas. But none of it addressed the core issue, that the home sat on a dormant floodplain activated by legal dam releases. It was a truth too big to spin. Meanwhile, the community was beginning to fracture. Neighbors who once shared barbecues and school carpools were now arguing over liability, flood insurance, and class action lawsuits. Some homeowners tried to sell quickly, but word had already spread and property values were in freefall. Realtors avoided the area altogether. Inspectors refused to certify homes for new mortgages, and insurance companies began issuing non-renewal notices en masse. As the pressure on the HOA intensified, so did internal conflict. Whistleblowers emerged from within the board, revealing emails and internal memos that showed the HOA had known about the potential flood risk as early as the second construction phase. One document, dated nearly a year prior, clearly referenced a potential hydrological threat stemming from upstream dam infrastructure. Another email mentioned the Carter name specifically, questioning whether his military absence posed an obstacle or an opportunity. The implications were damning. Faced with mounting evidence and angry homeowners, some board members resigned in disgrace. Others lawyered up, preparing for the inevitable lawsuits. The remaining leadership tried to place blame on the developers, but they had already disappeared, having folded their LLCs and moved on to projects in neighboring counties. The county government, now under scrutiny from local media and state regulators, issued a statement acknowledging oversight failures in the approval process, but stopped short of accepting legal liability. Daniel, through all this, remained silent in public, but meticulous behind the scenes. His legal team ensured that every dam release was properly recorded and compliant with federal regulations. The Army Corps of Engineers confirmed that the dam was operating within its approved parameters and that the rising water levels were a natural consequence of prolonged rainfall combined with poor downstream planning. No court in the country could fault a landowner for maintaining his legal infrastructure, especially when the risk had been so clearly communicated months in advance. With each rainfall, the water pushed a little further into the heart of Brook Pine Meadows. Basements were evacuated. Electrical panels were shut down. Mold began to spread. Families with young children were forced into hotels, waiting to see if the floodwaters would spare their homes. But the water showed no favoritism. It followed the lay of the land, the same land Daniel's grandfather had studied, surveyed, and protected. Nature was reclaiming what had been recklessly taken. Now, no one could ignore the truth. The HOA had gambled with stolen land, and their confidence had been built on fiction. The very infrastructure they had disregarded was now delivering accountability inch by inch, gallon by gallon. And in the eyes of the public, it wasn't the veteran who had caused the damage. It was the board that had ignored his warnings, exploited his absence, and built homes on borrowed time. That time had run out. The storm system that finally broke the stalemate wasn't a violent one. It wasn't a hurricane or flash flood. It was a slow, relentless kind of rainfall that settled in for days, seeping into every crack, saturating every inch of ground, and refusing to leave. For Brook Pine Meadows, this was a tipping point. The earth beneath the subdivision, once firm and compacted by construction crews, began to soften. Saturated soil gave way beneath foundations. Minor flooding turned into structural damage. What had once been a collection of pristine cookie-cutter homes now looked like a war zone of soggy carpets, bowed walls, and broken promises. The creek that once trickled quietly through the woods now resembled a slow-moving river. Residents who had mocked the idea of water rights were now asking if sandbags and pumps would be enough. For some, it was already too late. Multiple houses saw their lower floors completely overtaken by floodwater. Electrical systems failed. HVAC units were submerged. Toxic mold warnings circulated as health officials began advising evacuations for the most severely affected homes. Emergency services began receiving multiple daily calls from the same zip code. Some pumps failed one after another. Families relocated to hotels or moved in with relatives. Insurance claims flooded adjusters' offices, but many were denied outright due to undisclosed flood zone risk. Others were delayed indefinitely pending investigations. Homeowners who had once prided themselves on the value of their properties now faced the horrifying reality of being underwater, financially and literally. Media attention ramped up. Local TV crews camped near the flooded streets. Drones captured footage of submerged lawns, floating patio furniture, and roads disappearing under murky water. The story caught national interest. A veteran returns from service to find his land stolen and used to build luxury homes, only for the dam he legally controlled to bring a reckoning none could stop. Headlines called it the flood of justice, and public sentiment turned quickly. Where once there was skepticism and legal posturing, now there was outrage, and not toward Daniel. Investigations were launched at every level. The county commission announced an emergency audit of all zoning decisions tied to the development. Subpoenas were issued to the HOA, the developers, and even members of the planning board. A whistleblower inside the zoning office confirmed that multiple land documents had been approved despite glaring inconsistencies, and the original environmental review was found to have been falsified or completely skipped. The developers, hiding behind shell companies and legal buffers, were difficult to reach. Their offices had been emptied, their contacts disconnected. The paper trail was murky, but the damage they left behind was unmistakably real. As pressure built, the remaining members of the HOA were served with a class action lawsuit from the residents themselves. Dozens of homeowners, now financially and physically displaced, united to demand compensation for negligence, fraud, and willful concealment of risk. The lawsuit cited Daniel's documented warnings, federal dam records, and the HOA's internal emails. Depositions were scheduled. Bank accounts were frozen. Panic set in. Those who had once arrogantly dismissed the warnings were now facing personal financial ruin. And still, Daniel did not gloat. He continued his maintenance at the dam, kept records, responded professionally to federal inquiries, and avoided any public comment. His quiet, lawful approach only made the HOA look worse. He hadn't taken revenge. He had exercised his rights. What happened downstream wasn't sabotage. It was a natural and legal consequence of ignoring the truth, of building over nature without regard for its laws or history. The neighborhood fell into a kind of limbo. For sale signs lined the streets, but no buyers came. Lenders blacklisted the area. Real estate websites flagged every home with a red warning banner. Located in an active flood risk zone, disclosure required. Several families defaulted on their mortgages. A few tried to sue their title companies. Others simply walked away, abandoning properties that once symbolized success. Meanwhile, FEMA finalized its reclassification of the entire development as a high-risk floodplain. New flood maps were released showing the full extent of the basin, which clearly overlapped with more than 80% of the subdivision. Future development was halted indefinitely. Permits were revoked. Plans for an expansion phase were canceled. A park that had been under construction was torn down before it was even completed. The reckoning wasn't just physical. It was economic, social, and reputational. The subdivision, that had once been a model of modern planning, was now a case study in catastrophic oversight. Urban planning students were already dissecting it in classrooms. County officials braced for re-election fallout. And across town, Daniel's name, once buried under fake signatures and stolen property lines, was being quietly cleared and restored. Brook Pine Meadows had tried to erase a legacy and rewrite the rules of the land. But the land remembered, and when the water came, it didn't just flood basements. It exposed corruption, it swept away lies, and it rebalanced power in the most poetic, inevitable way possible. The aftermath of the flooding left Brook Pine Meadows in ruins, both physically and legally. What remained wasn't a thriving community, but a cautionary tale of arrogance, deception, and the cost of ignoring natural law. Homeowners, once promised quiet suburban comfort and rising property values, were now navigating FEMA claims, black mold remediation, and the financial wreckage of a neighborhood built on lies. The HOA had effectively dissolved, its board members entangled in lawsuits, public shame, and in some cases, criminal investigations tied to zoning fraud and document forgery. The county, having spent months denying any wrongdoing, was now forced to answer under oath. A grand jury convened to examine the zoning process that led to the approval of homes built on a designated floodplain. Whistleblowers confirmed that bribes had exchanged hands. At least 2 county officials were indicted on charges of corruption, abuse of authority, and falsifying public records. The developers who had initiated the scheme were tracked down through offshore accounts and complex corporate shells, though they tried to shield themselves from liability. Court orders began freezing assets and issuing subpoenas internationally. Meanwhile, Daniel's story had become emblematic of a larger conversation. National media outlets ran features not just about his dam and the flood, but about the broader problem of unchecked HOAs, predatory development, and the rights of property owners, especially veterans. Interviews, op-eds, and podcasts debated everything from land theft to environmental negligence. Daniel, however, remained measured in his response. He wasn't a crusader or a headline seeker. He was a man who had honored his grandfather's legacy and exercised his rights when no one else would listen. With legal and environmental officials now fully recognizing the dam's importance, Federal engineers re-inspected the entire structure. It passed every test. The dam had performed exactly as designed, stabilizing the reservoir, protecting the upper land, and gradually releasing excess water downstream as per federal guidelines. No violations. No overreach. The flood was not an act of revenge, but of nature reclaiming its course. It became clear that Daniel had not caused the destruction. The HOA and developers had invited it through negligence and greed. Property buyouts began. FEMA worked with the state to offer voluntary relocation assistance to affected homeowners. Many accepted, with home values having cratered and no viable resale market. Walking away became the only sane option for families who had once believed they'd found their forever homes. The county, under intense political pressure, created a special fund to assist with demolition and recovery efforts, funded in part by civil penalties imposed on the developers and HOA leadership. Daniel, now officially restored as the rightful landowner of the entire basin, faced a choice. He could leave the land as it was, a quiet victory, a flooded reminder of justice served. But instead, he began making plans for something more enduring. With help from environmental nonprofits and veterans groups, he proposed converting the floodplain into a protected wetland and wildlife habitat. The area, once stripped of its natural features, would be restored, this time with native plants, restored water channels, and a conservation easement to protect it from future development. The proposal gained traction quickly. Donations poured in, grants were awarded, and in a unanimous vote, the county agreed to designate the land as a public conservation site under Daniel's stewardship. A portion of the land would be named in honor of his grandfather, a plaque to be installed near the dam, acknowledging the foresight of man who had seen value in a piece of land long before anyone else. As the homes were demolished and the land slowly returned to its natural contours, something remarkable happened. Wildlife began to return. Birds nested near the reservoir. Deer traced the edges of the new wetland. And the dam, once the center of controversy, became a quiet monument to resilience, engineering, and the unwavering strength of generational legacy. Former residents, now scattered across the state, reflected on the events with a mix of bitterness and understanding. Many had come to accept that their loss was a result not of cruelty, but of willful blindness, trusting in a system that promised too much and delivered far too little. A few even reached out to Daniel to apologize, recognizing that the man they once dismissed had only tried to warn them of the truth they didn't want to see. The land, now unburdened by legal disputes and construction, healed slowly under Daniel's careful watch. He hosted volunteer cleanups and educational tours, showing school groups how wetlands worked and how water could be managed sustainably. Where McMansions once stood, cattails and wildflowers now bloomed. It wasn't revenge, it was redemption. Brookpine Meadows no longer existed on any map. The sign was gone. The streets were gone. All that remained was a stretch of land returned to its original purpose, undisturbed, protected, and alive. And at its heart stood a dam, a soldier, and the enduring proof that no matter how deep corruption tries to bury the truth, the water will always find its way home. If this story moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful real-life stories that expose injustice and celebrate resilience. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in Daniel's shoes? And remember, sometimes nature speaks louder than words. Don't miss the next jaw-dropping tale. Hit the bell icon so you're the first to know. Thanks for watching.